Whether you know it or not, all aspects of your actions, habits, and consistency are all controlled by this one single factor. Listen, I haven't missed a habit in what is now approaching 4 months, and I accredit all of that to single-handedly my understanding of identity. And so in this video, I plan to pass that knowledge down to you so that you can do the same in the most effective and time-efficient way possible. So, identity. It is single-handedly the most important thing when determining whether you'll be consistent with a habit in the long run or not. And you might think I'm being really hyperbolic just to hype this thing up, but no, this has been a well-established fact, and whether you've noticed or not, it's been under your nose the entire time. So, as one example, you might know the book Atomic Habits. And in one of the very clear quotes from the beginning chapters of this book, James Clear states that behind every system of actions is a system of beliefs, and actions that aren't incongruent with the self cannot possibly last. Your habits are how you embody your identity. Now, these are some pretty big, bold claims, right? And coming from possibly the most famous consistency and habits book of all time, clearly these words must have some credibility behind them. In that very same chapter, he talks about how most people, when they're setting their goals, first think about what they want to achieve. Then they think about, well, what should I do to achieve that goal? And then they believe that, after they do all of that, then they'll finally feel like the person, the identity that does that thing. That leads us to outcome-based habits. But he says what you should instead do is go in the reverse order. Think first about becoming the person who can, then doing those actions as a result of that identity, which will naturally and inevitably get you the completion of your goal. You can see here the 3 layers of the who, the how, and then the what. We need to start from the very bottom, and that will spill over into all the other categories. Like, for example, imagine person A and person B. They're both offered a cigarette, and one says, "No, I'm trying to quit." The other says, "No, I'm not a smoker." Which one's more likely to quit in the long term? Assuming that everything else about them is the same, just from this one statement, what can you tell? Well, you would obviously say that the second person is more likely to quit. Why? Because we intuitively grasp that one person is trying to do the action of quitting while the other person is being the identity of quitting, right? And that distinction, although subtle, makes the world's difference. Now, additionally, identity also forms the baseline in our habits, which is something I went really in-depth into in my last video. So if you want to learn more about what exactly the baseline is, you can watch that. But in a very quick nutshell, basically, your performance will fluctuate up and down all the time, and there's nothing you can do about that. And you can climb as high as you want, which is what people focus on, but it will always fall down to some baseline, and that's what matters. And the thing that actually controls where your baseline is, where that unbreachable standard is for you, is your identity. And that's one of the most important things that you can have when trying to be consistent, because if a habit is underneath your baseline, then you will never, ever, no matter what, miss doing that habit because it's in your baseline. So with all that said, perhaps it's a good idea to go a little bit into what exactly is a belief, right? Let's understand it, break it down to its very core principles, and then build up from there how we can manipulate it to our will, right? So our identity, in essence, is basically just all the beliefs we have about ourselves and how we relate to the world around us, right? And we can visualize this in a sort of system of scales, right? I think we're all familiar with how a scale works. You put a weight on one side and you put a weight on the other side, and it leans to whichever side is heavier, right? So every belief that you have, and beliefs about ourselves and the world around us, that's, our identity-based beliefs, is going to function in a sort like this scale. So if the belief is, I'm good at sales, you're gonna have 2 sides, I am and I am not. And throughout your experiences in life, you will cast votes to either side of the scale. And depending on how much votes you've casted on either side, that scale is gonna lean in some direction. And which way that scale leans and how much it leans is your belief about that thing. Because you've got to understand that not all experiences are going to have the exact same weight, right? One extremely traumatic experience that you have about something could outweigh 100 tiny experiences that you have, right? That I guess, intuitively, hopefully makes sense to you, right? You could have a very strong belief about something, but then you have an extremely emotional, traumatic experience, and then you get PTSD about this one belief, and suddenly that's the equivalent of, while you have 100 tiny rocks stacked on one side, you just suddenly drop a massive boulder on the other side, and that just flings off all the other rocks because it's just so much heavier. So based off of all that, your identity is just a sum of all these scales. Now, this is not enough scales. Scale that up by like a billion gazillion, and you have what your identity actually looks like. Every single thing, every aspect that you can have any sort of belief about, you have a scale for. You have a scale for absolutely everything. And the total sum of all of these scales is what creates you. It's what creates your unique identity. So now with that knowledge, when we want to change our identity about something, it's not like attacking this vague enemy that we don't even know and can't understand. It's just, we have a bunch of scales. We have to find the right scale, and we just have to add weights to that side, shift the scale, and we have changed our identity. That's all we have to do, right? So easier said than done. How exactly do we do that? Well, first of all, let's cover what exactly is an experience. Well, an experience is going to be anything that shifts your identity in any way, or shifts your belief in any way. That just counts as an experience. So let's say we're talking about your beliefs about your basketball skills. Well, one experience could be how you did in the game that day, right? That'll change your beliefs. That'll stack a rock. You could be thinking about how you played in practice today. Or an experience could be someone complimenting you on your skills, because that's also an experience. If someone says you played really great, you'll think, oh, I must be pretty great then, right? And even an experience could be constantly replaying a terrible moment, a key miss that you had over and over again in your mind. And that's really the key one, because you have to understand that we don't only think about real-world physical experiences. When we have imagined or remembered experiences, every time you remember that experience, you're stacking another weight. And that weight might not be as heavy as the original experience, but every time you keep replaying that over and over and over and over again in your mind, that becomes the dominant narrative. You just keep stacking tiny rocks over and over and over and over again until before you know it, you've stacked so much weight. And you don't even know why, because the actual physical experiences don't reflect that. But it's that mental, imagined stuff that also contributes to these scales. Okay, cool. So you understand what an experience can be. Well then, what determines its weight? What determines how heavy it is? And this is a very good question that leads us to a key point in this, which is how we interpret an event is, first of all, completely subjective to us. And second of all, that completely subjective interpretation that we have is what then determines its weight on that scale. So for example, two people could be exposed to the exact same event in the exact same situation, but cast completely different votes on completely different sides of the spectrum just based on how they interpret that experience. Because again, it's all about what you think about it. It doesn't matter the objective reality of it, it's just what you think, right? So you might know the Rorschach ink blot test, where people are shown just like random ink blots, and I have two people looking at it saying bat, butterfly, right? And people see different things, but the point I'm making here is that identity works in just the exact same way. Every day, in every moment, we are shown a bunch of these ink blots. If you think about it, like there's nothing that necessarily makes these ink blots more abstract and subjective than what we see in the real world every day. That too is completely up to interpretation and completely depends on what you see it. It's all based on the labels we assign to everything. So in reality, the only thing that matters in what your brain thinks about that is how you interpret that event. So then in theory, that leads us to think, hopefully, if you're thinking, which I advise you do think as you watch this video, then it makes us think, okay, well, what if we just go into life and every event that happens, we interpret it, we perceive it as a positive vote towards the identity we're trying to make. So that's a great idea. How do we do that? Well, what impacts our perceptions? What determines how we perceive things? What determines the assumption that we make about something when we see it? Well, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, which you'll see in a second, it's our beliefs. Because if you think about it, our beliefs are the lens through which we see the world, right? Like, we interpret things around us by what we believe to be true, by our knowledge. And when we see something, we filter it through our beliefs and we reach a conclusion. And that's our interpretation of the event. But that leads us to a dilemma, because if we're trying to prove to ourselves that we're good at sales, but we believe that we're bad at sales, then that belief will lead us to interpret events to mean that we're bad at sales, because that's our belief. So we'll keep subconsciously finding evidence using confirmation bias, because confirmation bias is a core trait of human psychology. And if you think logically, why wouldn't it apply here? Of course it applies here, right? So all our brain is looking to do is constantly confirm those existing beliefs. And that leads us to this loop where your beliefs create your perceptions, which leads votes to reaffirming that belief. So for example, an atheist could never see an event as being a sign from God, right? That wouldn't even ever pop into his mind. He would never even conceive of that idea to like reject it in the first place. It's just like his beliefs are that God doesn't exist. So he doesn't even think about the fact that an event might have been a sign from God. And meanwhile, the person who does believe in God might see that same act, that same event, that same occurrence as some sort of sign from God. And that perception would lead to one more vote in favor of the existence of God, right? And I don't mean to take any sides here about whether God exists or not. That is really beyond the purpose of this video. But I hope you can see how, depending on someone's beliefs, they can interpret an event completely differently and then affirm completely different beliefs, leading to more of those same perceptions over and over again. So then that leads us to the question, if we already have a negative belief, how do we change it? How do we change our perceptions to get out of this negative cycle? Now, before we get into all of that, I just want to take a quick break from this video to tell you about the free community we have. Basically, we have free courses and resources in there to really get you to that 100% consistency. And along with that, we have a community of like-minded men who are also trying to become consistent and will keep you accountable with your habits. So if you're trying to become more consistent, your actionable step right now is to just go to the very first link in the description and join. Again, it's completely free. And with that said, let's get right back into the video. Well, first of all, it's important to note here that all hope is not lost, right? If you think back to the scales, it depends how much it's skewed, right? It can be skewed to different degrees. Depending on how much it's skewed, that's going to determine how much it's going to affect your confirmation bias and feed into this loop. And if all that sounds like a bunch of jargon, let me put it this way. Let's say your scale leans so that it's pointing 60% towards I am not and 40% towards I am. Well, then when you look to perceive evidence and experiences in the real world, you're not going to be seeing those completely objectively in a 50-50 manner. You're going to be slightly biased, right? That 60%, 40% bias towards confirming the confirmation bias of I am not, right? But still, you have that 40% of I am. So you're not going to be unable to interpret events positively. It's just going to be slightly skewed. On the other hand, if you have a scale that's tipped 100 and 0, which I don't think is possible, maybe you have like 99.99 and 0.01, in which case, then it's going to be really hard to change your beliefs. But I promise none of you have that sort of belief about anything that is probably worth changing. So you should be fine on that regard. And when you think about that, then all you really need is throughout the day, just consciously putting effort into recognizing experiences that affirm the identity you're trying to become. Basically what that means is, let's say you're trying to become good at sales. I know I've been using this example a lot, but it's just to hammer the point home with one specific example. Let's say from now on, every day, every time you convince someone of something, right? Every time you ask someone to do something and they do it, every time you get your way, be like, oh, you see, I just got my way. I just convinced someone. I must be really good at sales, right? Because sales is just about convincing someone. And if I was able to sell him on doing this thing for me, I must be able to sell products to people, right? And suddenly you've cast a vote towards that identity. Even if it's not big, certainly you can do this multiple times per day. And all it takes is that conscious looking for votes, right? Just that act of trying to see these votes is going to affirm that identity. And of course, you could do the opposite. You could For example, every time that someone doesn't do something you want them to do, you can say, oh, I must be bad at sales because I couldn't convince them, right? So again, see that this can go either way. But if you just consciously try to interpret events as positive, that's going to be a big win. The other thing, which is also very much related, is what I call vote farming. Basically, give yourself easy activities that you can do to farm votes, farm wins. So, for example, when I was trying to affirm the identity of being someone who always gets 100% on my habit tracker, what I did was I just made the habits very easy at the start, which meant affirming that identity was very easy because I just had to do the easy habits. And I was just constantly vote farming until that identity became very strong. And then I could gradually make the habits whatever the hell I wanted, but since the identity was already so strong, it would just work without that much effort on my end. And then third and finally, we can use imagined or remembered events. So one thing you can do, going back to that memory example, is just constantly replay moments of when you did something well towards this activity. Constantly replay memories in your mind of the times you proved to yourself in a good way that you are this identity. And if you constantly replay these over and over and over in your mind until they become the dominant narrative, until that's the only example you can think of, and in effect, you just stack a shit ton of positive experiences for that from replaying that memory. And actually, affirmations and visualizations fall into this exact category. So if you were thinking about where those came in, well, this is exactly where. And when you're doing affirmations, you have to have the thought, which is just kind of like the affirmation itself, being like, oh, I am this person. And then you have to have a clear image. The more vivid the image is, the better, because you need your mind to actually believe this is real. If it doesn't believe it's real, it won't believe it. That's, I think, pretty obvious. And then it needs to be emotionally charged, because the more emotionally charged something is, the more it's going to stick. I think that's common sense. I can explain it, but I think that should make sense to you. Okay, so we've covered that, but now on to the other factors that are in weight. And one of these is the emotional charge. Now, I know, I literally just said this for the previous thing, right? And now it's coming up. Well, great, it aligns. Emotional charge is very important for weight. You can imagine that if you have one experience that positively supports the identity, but you don't really care about it, then it won't impact you much. But if like it's the same experience, but somebody's life is on the line and you fail and they die, right? Okay, hopefully this doesn't happen to you, very hopefully. But if it does, that experience is going to be much more emotionally charged, and that vote is going to be cast a lot stronger. You're going to be like, oh no, I'm never going to do this activity, like this one action again, because last time I did it, I failed and my family member died. Something like that, right? But the emotional charge determines how strong the weight is. And the third and final factor in weight is recency, right? Because this goes into our other bias, and biases are a big part of this, as you might be starting to pick up on this theme, because, you know, this is all psychology at the end of the day, and biases are a core part of our psychology and how we interpret things, so they come into play here. And this is recency bias. So when we're thinking about the votes that we cast, I've got this illustration as little balls in the scale. Think of them as just like slowly degrading over time, and they lose their weight. They become lighter the longer they stand there. They're just like made of some unstable element, and they just decay into the air and vanish. To illustrate how this works in a more concrete example, let's say there's a skill that you haven't done in like 3 years. Let's say it's just passing a soccer ball. Okay, great. You might have stacked a bunch of beliefs in favor of the fact that you are actually very good at this, right? And you might have had like hundreds of those prior to this, but you took a 3-year break and then you came back to it, and then you had like 5 attempts at passing a ball and you were horrible, right? Now, the actual weight scale might be like 5 experiences compared to 300 experiences, but those 5 experiences, because they're more recent, your brain sees them as more representative of where you're at currently. And so you can imagine you'd say, oh, I guess I'm not very good at passing the ball anymore, which would be the correct assumption here, which is why our brain treats those in that way. But just keep in mind that the more recent something is, the more important it will seem in terms of its weight. So with all of that, we can finally get at some concrete formula, right? We've been talking about all this theory, we've been talking about all these psychology, these biases. Okay, here's your formula for solving weight. It is your interpretation, which is how positive or negative it is, times the emotional charge, times the recency. And there you go. If we just maximize these three things, and also the number of total experiences, right? If we have as many experiences as possible with as much weight, which is made up of these three things, then we can shift our identity so incredibly fast. And of course, we talked about interpretation, right? That's just like, try to make a habit out of interpreting everything as supporting that experience, which is not that hard, right? And a lot of the time, you'll find yourself kind of arguing in your head about like, you'll notice that your default assumption is to say this habit is experienced in the opposite direction, but then you'll kind of catch that and you'll be like, oh no, but actually I can interpret this habit like this, which means it's a positive thing, and just do that, and you'll become really good at that and be able to convince yourself that anything is actually a positive experience. Okay, then let's talk about emotional charge. Okay, how do we add emotional charge? Well, again, this is a topic that has a lot to it and it could realistically warrant its entire own video. But okay, we just want to become more invested in this activity. How? Well, we can put a lot of effort into it because, when we put more effort and time and energy into something, we're more invested in its outcome and we care about it more. And additionally, and this is the major thing when it comes to emotional charge, it's the stakes, right? The stakes are what's going to determine how much emotional charge there's going to be. And stakes basically means what is there to be won or lost, right? What's on the line? What can you gain? What can you lose? And I've made a whole video on stakes. I'll probably link it up there somewhere if I remember. But just maximize the stakes associated with an action and you'll maximize the emotional charge. You can also just try to make it seem like the biggest deal in the world. Again, mental tricks, right? Just convince yourself this is a really big deal. Like, trust me, bro, like this is gonna change your life, right? And even if you're not gonna fully believe it and actually like change everything and be like, yes, you're right, this is the most life-changing experience of my entire life, right? It's gonna make a difference. It's gonna bump it up a little bit, and over time that will add up. So that was a lot that I just threw at you very fast, so let's recap all of this. Your beliefs are like this, they're scales. How does it work? Well, it's the number of experiences you have times the weight of those experiences. Okay, what creates an experience? Well, an experience is anything that you interpret as, having an impact on your identity or that belief. And we talked about that loop where your beliefs impact how you perceive something, which casts votes, which goes back onto the belief. And it's a loop. Okay, what determines the weight? Well, it's the interpretation times the emotional charge times the recency, right? And there you go. If you combine all of these things and just grind out a bunch of experiences with as much weight as possible, you will completely transform your identity. And once you transform your identity, you never act out of accordance with your identity. And this is a core fact that you should get ingrained in your mind. Because if you believe that you are like an Olympic athlete, right? And I'm saying if you like genuinely, truly 100% believe this, and I'm not saying this is something you will do, but just as an example, then realistically, you will train every day, you will eat healthy every day, and like, eating unhealthy, just skipping some days out of laziness, that's not even an option for you because you see yourself as this peak of athleticism and discipline, and it's just like, it's not even considered in your mind. You just see it as, I am an Olympic athlete, this is what I do, right? The same way the atheist couldn't even possibly perceive an event as a sign of God, the athlete can't even perceive of the option to skip the gym that day. And listen, if you want this entire guide just as a download, I have that for free on my school community. So instead of trying to screenshot all of this, just go there. It's completely free. You'll get these resources and also a completely free course. So that's going to be the first link in the description. And with that said, take action, and I'll see you next time.